Stay disciplined when you feel lost in life. There is a moment no one prepares you for. It is not dramatic. It does not come with noise, with visible failure, or with something breaking apart in front of your eyes. It is subtle, almost invisible. It is the moment when you realize that something inside you has gone quiet. You are still functioning. You are still waking up, still doing what needs to be done, still responding to life as expected. From the outside, nothing seems wrong, but internally, there is a distance, a gap between who you are and how you are showing up. You tell yourself it is temporary. You assume it is just a phase, something that will pass once you feel better, once you think more clearly, once you figure things out. So you wait. You postpone. You delay action, believing that clarity must come first. But while you wait, something else is happening. Time keeps moving, but you do not move with it. You begin to operate on autopilot. You start repeating days instead of living them. Small decisions get ignored, small efforts get postponed, and slowly, without realizing it, you begin to drift. And drifting does not feel dangerous at first. That is what makes it so powerful. There is no immediate consequence, no alarm, no signal telling you that you are going in the wrong direction. Just a quiet accumulation of inaction, of hesitation, of moments where you could have acted but chose not to. You start believing that the problem is confusion, that the reason you are stuck is because you do not have the right answers yet. So you convince yourself that once things make sense, once you feel aligned, once you feel ready, then you will move. But that moment rarely comes, because clarity is not something you wait for. It is something that emerges through action. And this is where most people lose themselves, not because they are incapable, not because they lack potential, but because they have unknowingly trained themselves to depend on feeling certain before they act. So when uncertainty shows up, they stop. And when they stop, life does not pause with them. This is the truth that changes everything. You do not get lost in a single moment. You get lost in the accumulation of moments where you choose not to act. And in those moments, when your thoughts are unclear and your emotions are unstable, there is only one thing that can keep you grounded. Discipline, not motivation, not inspiration. Discipline, the ability to continue, even when you do not feel like it. The decision to move, even when the direction is not fully visible. The commitment to show up, even when nothing inside you is pushing you forward. This is not about having everything figured out. This is about refusing to abandon yourself while you figure it out. And once you understand this, once you truly see it, you stop waiting for the perfect moment. You start becoming the person who moves anyway. The silence before the fall. It never begins with chaos. It begins with silence. A silence that feels harmless at first. A quiet shift that is easy to ignore because nothing around you seems to be falling apart. You are still functioning, still meeting expectations, still maintaining the structure of your life. But something inside you is no longer fully present. Your actions lose intensity. Your focus becomes scattered. You start doing things out of habit instead of intention. What once required effort now feels automatic, but not in a good way. It feels empty. You stop questioning yourself in meaningful ways. You stop challenging your own standards. You begin to accept days that feel slightly off, convincing yourself that it is normal, that everyone goes through this, that it will pass on its own. And that is where the shift happens. Because the problem is not the silence itself. The problem is what you do in response to it. Most people do nothing. They let the silence stretch. They allow the disconnection to grow quietly in the background. They keep moving, but without awareness, without direction, without intention. You start replacing purpose with routine, not because you consciously chose to, but because it is easier than confronting the discomfort of feeling disconnected. Routine gives you the illusion of control. It makes you feel like you are still on track, even when you are not. It allows you to avoid asking the difficult questions, but over time, that avoidance has a cost. You begin to feel less engaged with your own life, less invested in your own actions. Things that once mattered start to feel distant. Goals lose their weight. Progress feels irrelevant, and because nothing is visibly broken, you do not take it seriously. That is what makes this stage so dangerous. It does not hurt enough to force change. It does not disrupt your life enough to demand attention. It simply allows you to drift. Day after day, decision after decision, you slowly move further away from alignment without realizing it. Until one day, the silence is no longer quiet. It becomes confusion, frustration, a sense that you are lost even though you cannot clearly explain why. But by then, the pattern has already been established. You have trained yourself to ignore the early signals, to tolerate disconnection, to function without presence. And that is the real fall, not the moment everything collapses, but the moment you stop paying attention, because once you stop paying attention, you stop making intentional choices. And when that happens, your direction is no longer something you control. It becomes something you drift into. But here is what most people never realize. If you can recognize this silence early, if you can become aware of that subtle disconnection before it grows, you gain something incredibly powerful. You gain the ability to interrupt the pattern, to act before the fall, to reintroduce intention where there was only routine. And that changes everything. Because now the question is no longer whether you feel lost. The question is why you are waiting to act when you already know something is off. The illusion of needing answers. At some point, you start telling yourself a very convincing story. You say that you just need more clarity, that you need to understand things better before you move, that acting without certainty would be a mistake. And on the surface, it sounds resumno. It sounds responsible. It feels like you are being careful, like you are avoiding unnecessary errors. But this is where the illusion begins. Because what you call waiting for clarity is often just hesitation dressed as logic. You sit with your thoughts, analyzing every possibility. You replay scenarios, you imagine outcomes, you try to predict what could go wrong. You convince yourself that one more day of thinking will give you the answer you need. But the answer never fully arrives. Not because you are incapable of understanding, but because clarity is not something that appears in stillness. It is something that forms through movement. And this is the trap. You begin to associate action with risk and inaction with safety. You believe that by waiting you are protecting yourself from failure, but what you are actually doing is protecting yourself from progress. Because every day you delay action, you reinforce a pattern where you only move when you feel ready. A pattern where uncertainty becomes a stop sign instead of a signal to engage. And over time, this pattern becomes your default. You no longer question it. You no longer see it as a problem. It becomes your way of operating. You wait before starting. You hesitate before deciding. You pause before committing. And slowly your life begins to reflect that hesitation. Opportunities pass, not because they were impossible, but because you were waiting for confirmation that never came. Decisions get postponed until they lose relevance. Energy gets consumed in thinking instead of doing. You start to feel stuck, but you cannot pinpoint why. Because from your perspective, you are trying, you are thinking, you are analyzing, you are searching for the right move. But the truth is much simpler. You are not lacking answers. You are avoiding action in the absence of them. And this is where discipline becomes uncomfortable. Because discipline does not wait for clarity. It acts in spite of confusion. It does not demand certainty before movement. It creates certainty through movement. This idea goes against everything your mind wants to believe. Your mind wants guarantees. It wants assurance that your effort will lead somewhere meaningful. It wants to eliminate doubt before you begin. But that is not how growth works. You do not see the full path before taking the first step. You see just enough to move. And then the next step reveals itself. This is what most people never accept. They keep waiting for a complete map when in reality life only gives you fragments. And those fragments only appear when you engage. So the real question is not whether you have enough clarity. The real question is whether you are willing to move without it. Because the longer you depend on answers to begin, the longer you will remain exactly where you are. And once you see this clearly, once you recognize that clarity is a result of action and not a prerequisite, something shifts. You stop asking, "What if I choose wrong?" and you start asking a better question. What happens if I keep standing still? That question is harder to ignore, because deep down you already know the answer, and that realization leads to an even more uncomfortable truth. If waiting is not the solution, then what exactly is keeping you stuck? When the mind becomes a labyrinth, at first, it feels like thinking is helping you. You sit with your thoughts, trying to understand what is wrong, trying to organize what feels scattered, trying to find a direction that makes sense. It feels productive. It feels like progress. After all, you are not ignoring the problem. You are facing it. But slowly, something changes. Your thoughts stop leading somewhere and start circling back on themselves. You question one decision, then question the question itself. You analyze one path, then immediately doubt it. Every possible direction seems to come with a hidden flaw, a risk, a reason to hesitate. And before you realize it, your mind is no longer a tool. It becomes a maze, a place where every turn leads to another layer of uncertainty, where every answer creates two new questions, where movement feels impossible because nothing feels solid enough to stand on. You start overthinking things that once felt simple. Small decisions become heavy. Basic actions require mental negotiation. You spend more time evaluating possibilities than actually experiencing reality. And the worst part is that it feels justified, because in your mind, you are being careful. You are trying to make the right move. You are trying to avoid mistakes. But what is actually happening is something much more limiting. You are replacing action with analysis. You are using thought as a substitute for movement. And the more you do this, the more trapped you become. Because thinking without action does not resolve uncertainty. It amplifies it. Every scenario you imagine carries emotional weight. Every possibility feels real enough to influence your behavior. And since most of those scenarios involve some form of risk, your natural response is to hold back. So you stay where you are. Not because you chose to, but because every option feels equally uncertain. This is the hidden cost of overthinking. It does not protect you from mistakes. It prevents you from discovering what actually works. And in that state, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You start losing trust in yourself. You stop believing that you can handle the consequences of your decisions. You begin to rely more on perfect planning than on your own ability to adapt. You think that if you can just think a little more, analyze a little deeper, you will finally reach a point where everything feels clear. But that point does not exist. Because clarity is not found at the end of thought. It is found in the middle of action. And this is where discipline challenges you again, not by asking you to stop thinking, but by asking you to act before your mind feels ready, to move while the questions are still there, to take a step even when your thoughts are incomplete. This feels uncomfortable. It feels risky. It feels like you are abandoning logic. But in reality, you are restoring balance. You are putting thought back in its place as a guide, not a gatekeeper. Because your mind was never meant to trap you in endless loops. It was meant to support movement, not replace it. And once you understand this, you begin to see your thoughts differently, not as final answers, but as temporary interpretations, not as barriers, but as background noise that does not need to control your behavior. You stop waiting for your mind to become silent, and you start moving even while it is loud. That is the shift. Because when you learn to act inside the noise instead of waiting for silence, you break the cycle. You stop being trapped in the labyrinth. But that leads to another layer of pressure that most people do not talk about. If your thoughts are not the only thing holding you back, then why does it still feel so heavy to move forward? The invisible weight of unfulfilled expectations. There is a pressure you carry that no one else can see. It is not coming from your current situation. It is coming from a version of you that exists in your memory. The version that made plans, set standards, imagined a future that felt clear, structured, and certain. At some point, you decided who you were going to become. You set timelines. You created expectations. You told yourself where you should be by now, what you should have achieved, how far you should have gone. And maybe at the time it felt realistic. It felt possible. It felt like a natural progression. But life did not follow that script. Things took longer. Some paths did not work. Some decisions did not lead where you thought they would. And slowly, without noticing, a gap started to form. A gap between where you are and where you believed you would be. And that gap has weight. It does not show up as something obvious. It does not announce itself clearly. Instead, it settles quietly in your thoughts, in your energy, in the way you see yourself. Every time you think about starting again, that weight is there, reminding you of what you have not done, reminding you of how much time has passed, reminding you of the expectations you did not meet. And even if you do not say it out loud, there is a subtle narrative running in the background. I should be further than this. That sentence alone is enough to drain momentum, because instead of focusing on what you can do now, your attention gets pulled into what did not happen before. You start measuring your present against a past expectation. And no matter what you do, it feels insufficient. This is what makes it so difficult to move. It is not just about taking action. It is about taking action while carrying the emotional weight of everything you believe you failed to do. So you hesitate, not because you are incapable, but because every step forward feels like it is being judged by a version of you that expected more. And this creates a silent resistance. You delay starting because starting means confronting that gap. You avoid committing because committing means risking falling short again. You stay in place because, in a strange way, standing still protects you from confirming those fears. But that protection comes at a cost, because the longer you carry this weight without challenging it, the heavier it becomes. It starts influencing how you see your potential. It starts shaping your decisions. It begins to define what you believe you are capable of doing now. And that is where the real damage happens. Not in the missed expectations themselves, but in how they change your relationship with action. You stop acting from possibility. You start acting from doubt. Or worse, you stop acting at all. This is where discipline takes on a different role. It is no longer just about consistency. It becomes a way of separating your current actions from your past expectations. It allows you to move without constantly referencing what should have happened. It forces you to engage with reality as it is, not as you imagined it would be. And that shift is uncomfortable, because it requires you to let go of the version of yourself that had everything figured out. It requires you to accept that progress will not look the way you once planned, but it also gives you something powerful: freedom. Freedom from timelines that no longer serve you. Freedom from comparisons that hold you back. Freedom to act based on where you are, not where you thought you would be. And once that weight begins to lift, even slightly, something changes. Movement feels possible again. Not because everything is resolved, but because you are no longer trying to carry the past into every decision. But even with that awareness, there is still something that quietly drains your ability to act. Something less emotional, but just as powerful. Because sometimes, it is not the past that exhausts you. It is the constant demand of choosing what to do next. The fatigue of constant decision-making. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with physical effort. You can wake up after a full night of sleep and still feel drained before the day even begins. Not because you work too hard, but because your mind is already overloaded with choices. What should you focus on? What matters most right now? Where do you even begin? When you feel lost, everything becomes a decision. Simple actions that once felt automatic now require thought. You question where to invest your time, what direction to follow, what step actually makes sense. And because nothing feels clearly right, every option carries a level of uncertainty. So instead of acting, you pause. You evaluate. You hesitate. And with each moment of hesitation, your mental energy gets consumed. This is the hidden cost of having too many open possibilities without a clear structure. Your mind stays active, constantly scanning, constantly trying to optimize, constantly trying to avoid making the wrong move. But in doing so, it drains itself. Decision fatigue begins to take over. You start the day with intention, but as hours pass, your ability to choose weakens. What once felt manageable becomes overwhelming. Even small decisions begin to feel heavy. So you delay. You tell yourself you will decide later. You push things forward, hoping that clarity will come with time. But instead of reducing pressure, it accumulates. Because every postponed decision does not disappear. It stays. It lingers in the background, adding weight to your mental state. And eventually, your system reaches a point where it cannot process anymore. That is when inaction takes control. Not because you chose to stop, but because your mind no longer has the energy to keep deciding. So you default to what is easiest. Distractions, passive habits, repetitive behaviors that require no thought. And for a moment it feels like relief, because you are no longer forcing yourself to choose. But that relief is temporary, because underneath it, nothing has been resolved. The same questions remain. The same uncertainty is still there. The same lack of direction continues to exist. And when you return to reality, it feels even heavier. This is where most people misinterpret the problem. They think they lack discipline. They think they need more motivation, more willpower, more drive. But the real issue is not effort. It is overload. Too many decisions, too many possibilities, too little structure. And without structure, discipline becomes almost impossible to sustain. Because discipline is not just about pushing yourself to act. It is about reducing the friction that prevents action. It is about creating an environment where decisions are simplified, where movement becomes automatic, where you do not have to negotiate with yourself every time you need to do something. This is the shift. Instead of asking, "What should I do today?" you start deciding in advance. Instead of relying on how you feel in the moment, you create fixed points of action. You remove options, you limit choices, you make the path narrower, not wider, because a narrower path requires less energy to follow. And suddenly something changes. You no longer feel the same level of resistance. Not because your life became clearer, but because you reduced the number of decisions standing between you and action. That is how discipline begins to rebuild. Quietly, structurally, without needing constant mental effort. But even with fewer decisions, there is still a subtle danger that can pull you away without you noticing. Because sometimes it is not the complexity of choices that moves you off track. It is how easily you start accepting small deviations as normal. The normalization of drift. It rarely feels like a decision. You do not wake up one day and choose to lose focus. You do not consciously decide to step away from what matters. It happens in smaller ways, almost invisible at first. You delay something by a day. You loosen a standard just a little. You tell yourself it is not a big deal that you will get back on track tomorrow. And that is how it begins. A small adjustment, a slight deviation, something that feels harmless in isolation. But the problem is not the action itself. It is how quickly your mind adapts to it. What once felt like an exception starts to feel acceptable. What felt temporary starts to become normal. And without realizing it, you begin to shift your baseline. You start redefining what on track means. Not consciously, but through repetition. You skip once, then again. You postpone again, then again. And each time it becomes easier to justify, easier to ignore, easier to repeat. Until eventually, you are no longer aware that you have drifted. Because to you, this new version of your behavior feels familiar. That is the danger of normalization. It does not feel like failure. It feels like routine. You are still doing things. You are still moving. But the direction has changed and you did not notice when it happened. And because there is no clear breaking point, no dramatic moment where everything falls apart, there is nothing that forces you to stop and reassess. You continue, day after day, operating slightly below your own standard, but consistently enough that it becomes your new identity. This is where discipline quietly disappears, not in a single moment of weakness, but in a series of small permissions you give yourself. Permissions to do less, to wait longer, to ignore what you know you should be doing. And the more you allow those permissions, the more they shape your behavior. You start expecting less from yourself. You start accepting less effort as enough. You begin to operate in a version of your life that feels easier, but also less aligned. And over time, that gap grows. Not because you made a major mistake, but because you made many small ones that never felt significant enough to correct. This is how drift becomes your reality, quietly, gradually, without resistance. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to notice, because your reference point has already changed. You are no longer comparing yourself to your highest standard. You are comparing yourself to your most recent behavior. And that comparison will always justify staying where you are. This is why awareness alone is not enough. You can recognize that you have drifted, but if you do not actively interrupt the pattern, it will continue. Because normalization is powerful. It convinces you that what is happening is acceptable, that there is no urgency to change, that you still have time. But discipline challenges that illusion. It forces you to see clearly, to recognize that small deviations are not neutral. They accumulate, they shape direction, they define outcomes, and once you truly see that, something shifts. You stop negotiating with small compromises. You start treating them as signals. Signals that require correction. Not later, now. Because the longer you allow drift to define your behavior, the further you move away from the version of yourself you once intended to become. And that leads to a deeper internal conflict, because at some point, you begin to understand exactly what is happening. You see the patterns. You recognize the drift. You understand the gap. And yet, you still do not act. Which raises a difficult question. If you already understand yourself so well, why are you still standing still? The dangerous comfort of self-awareness. There is a point where understanding yourself stops being useful. You know your patterns. You can explain your behavior. You can articulate exactly why you feel stuck, why you hesitate, why you avoid certain actions. You have the language, the insight, the awareness. And that feels like progress. It feels like you are getting closer to a solution. But something subtle happens in this stage. You begin to confuse awareness with change. You think that because you can explain the problem, you are already moving toward solving it. You feel a sense of control, a sense of clarity, a sense that you are not lost anymore because at least you understand what is going on, but your actions remain the same. You still delay. You still hesitate. You still avoid what requires effort. And because you can justify it, because you can explain it so well, it becomes harder to challenge. This is the dangerous comfort. You are no longer blindly stuck. You are consciously stuck. And that is a much more stable position. Because now, every time you avoid action, you have a reason. You tell yourself you are processing. You tell yourself you are being patient. You tell yourself you are waiting for the right moment. And all of that sounds valid. But underneath it, nothing is changing. This is where self-awareness becomes a shield. Instead of exposing the problem, it protects it. You analyze instead of act. You reflect instead of move. You observe your behavior without interrupting it. And over time, this creates a false sense of growth. You feel like you are evolving because your understanding is deeper, but your results do not reflect that evolution. And that disconnect starts to grow. You begin to feel frustrated not because you do not understand what to do, but because you are not doing what you already understand. That frustration is important because it reveals the truth. The gap is no longer about knowledge. It is about execution. And this is where discipline becomes unavoidable, because discipline does not care how much you understand. It does not reward insight alone. It demands action. Consistent, repeated, sometimes uncomfortable action, even when you already know what is wrong. Especially when you already know. This is the shift that most people resist. They want understanding to be enough. They want clarity to automatically translate into movement. But that is not how it works. There is a separation between knowing and doing. And that separation can only be crossed through deliberate action. Not perfect action. Not fully confident action. Just action. This is where you have to be honest with yourself. If you already know what needs to be done, then the problem is no longer confusion. It is resistance. And resistance does not disappear through more thinking. It dissolves through movement. through choosing to act even when you do not feel like it, through breaking the pattern instead of explaining it again, because at some point insight stops being helpful and it starts becoming an excuse to delay, an excuse to stay where you are, an excuse to avoid the discomfort of doing what you already know you should do. And once you see that clearly, you can no longer hide behind understanding. You are left with a simpler, harder reality. You either act or you continue repeating the same cycle. There is no third option. And that realization leads to a deeper tension. Because now, it is no longer about what you know or what you feel. It is about who you are becoming through your actions, and whether that version of you aligns with the one you once promised yourself you would be. The fracture between who you are and who you promise to be. There is a version of you that still exists in your mind, not as a vague idea, but as something specific, clear, defined. The person you once decided you would become, the standards you set, the discipline you imagined, the life you believed you were building. At the time, it felt real. You were certain, focused, committed. You saw yourself acting differently, thinking differently, living with a level of consistency that made everything feel possible. But somewhere along the way, your actions stopped matching that vision. Not all at once, not in a dramatic way. It happened gradually, through small misalignments repeated over time. A day where you did less than you intended. A moment where you chose comfort instead of effort. A decision you postponed when you knew you should have acted, and each time it felt insignificant. But those moments accumulated. And now, there is a distance. A quiet but undeniable gap between who you are today and who you said you would be. You feel it in subtle ways. In the hesitation before starting something you once approached with certainty. In the lack of conviction behind your actions. In the way your standards feel less solid than they used to be. This is the fracture. Not just between your actions and your goals, but between your identity and your behavior. And that fracture creates tension. Because part of you still remembers, still knows what you are capable of, still holds on to the version of you that acted with clarity and discipline. But another part of you has adapted to inconsistency, has accepted lower standards, has become comfortable operating below your own expectations. And those two versions cannot fully coexist. So you feel it as internal conflict. You think about what you should be doing while continuing to do something else. You plan, but do not execute. You promise yourself change, but repeat the same patterns. And over time, this creates something deeper than frustration. It creates doubt. Not just about your situation, but about yourself. You start questioning whether you are still that person, whether you still have that level of discipline in you, whether that version of you was real, or just an idea that never fully materialized. This is where many people begin to disconnect from their own identity. They lower their expectations to match their current behavior. They redefine who they are based on what is easier to maintain. And in doing so, they reduce the tension. But they also lose something important. They lose alignment. Because the solution is not to forget who you promised to be. It is to close the gap. And that does not happen through intention. It happens through action. Repeated, consistent action that reestablishes the connection between identity and behavior. This is where discipline becomes something deeper. It is no longer just a tool for productivity. It becomes a way to rebuild trust with yourself. Every time you act in alignment with what you said you would do, you repair a small part of that fracture. You begin to prove to yourself that the version you once imagined is still accessible. Not because you feel like it, but because you choose to act like it. And that is the shift. You stop asking, "Do I feel like that person?" And you start asking, "What would that person do right now?" Then you do it, without negotiation, without waiting, without needing confirmation. Because identity is not something you declare, it is something you reinforce through behavior. And the more you align your actions with that standard, the more the fracture begins to close. Slowly, quietly, but consistently, until one day the gap is no longer something you feel. It is something you have crossed. But that leads to a fundamental question. If discipline is what rebuilds that identity, then what exactly is discipline beyond effort? Discipline as identity, not effort. Most people misunderstand discipline from the very beginning. They see it as something they have to force, something heavy, something that requires constant energy, constant motivation, constant resistance against what they feel. So they treat it like a temporary state, something they enter when they are strong and abandon when they are not. And because of that, discipline never becomes stable. It becomes conditional, dependent on mood, dependent on circumstances, dependent on whether or not they feel capable in that moment. But real discipline does not work like that. It is not something you activate. It is something you become. This is the shift that changes everything. When discipline is based on effort, you are always negotiating. You wake up and ask yourself if you feel like doing what needs to be done. You measure your energy, your mood, your willingness. And if those factors are not aligned, you hesitate. You delay. You adjust your standards. But when discipline becomes identity, the conversation changes. There is no negotiation. You do not ask if you feel like it. You act because it is who you are. Just like you do not question brushing your teeth or showing up to something that matters, you do not question the actions that define your discipline. They are not optional. They are part of you. This does not mean it becomes easy. It means it becomes non-negotiable. There is a difference. Effort-based discipline feels like pushing against resistance every time. Identity-based discipline removes the need to decide, because the decision has already been made. This is what the Stoics understood deeply. As taught by Epictetus, your life is shaped not by what you say, but by what you consistently do. And as reflected in Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Book 2, Paragraph 1, you are defined by your actions in the present moment, not by your intentions. This is where most people get stuck. They keep trying to feel disciplined instead of acting disciplined. They wait for internal alignment before external behavior. But identity is built in the opposite direction. You act first, you repeat, you reinforce. And over time, that behavior becomes natural. Not because it got easier, but because it became familiar. Because it became you. This is why small actions matter more than intense ones. Because identity is not built in extremes, it is built in repetition. Every time you follow through, even in a minimal way, you are sending a signal to yourself. This is who I am. And every time you do not, you send the opposite signal. The problem is not that you lack discipline. The problem is that you have not yet stabilized it into your identity. You still see it as something external, something you need to apply instead of something you embody. And as long as it stays external, it will always feel heavier than it should, because you will always have to choose it. But once it becomes internal, once it becomes part of how you see yourself, something shifts. You no longer rely on feeling ready. You rely on consistency. You no longer measure your progress by how intense your effort is. You measure it by how aligned your actions are with who you decided to be. And that alignment removes friction. Not completely, but enough to keep you moving. Even when you feel lost, even when you feel uncertain, even when nothing inside you is pushing you forward. Because now, movement is not a reaction, it is a standard, and that standard changes everything. But even with identity in place, there is still a challenge most people underestimate. Because what happens when your actions are not perfect? When they are incomplete, flawed, inconsistent? Is that still progress? Or is that just another form of falling short? The underrated power of imperfect movement. There is a belief that quietly destroys consistency. The belief that if your effort is not strong enough, not complete enough, not impressive enough, then it does not count. So you wait. You wait until you have enough energy to do it right. You wait until you can give your full focus, your best version, your highest level of performance. You tell yourself that starting small is not worth it, that partial effort is a waste, that if you cannot do it properly, you should not do it at all. And in that waiting, nothing happens. Days pass where you could have done something, but you chose to do nothing because it did not meet your internal standard. This is where the real problem begins. Because perfection does not create progress. Movement does. even when that movement is incomplete, even when it is flawed, even when it does not look the way you imagined. Most people overestimate the value of intensity and underestimate the power of continuity. They think one perfect day will change everything. But it is the accumulation of imperfect days that actually builds something real. A short effort repeated consistently has more impact than a strong effort that never becomes stable. But your mind resists this idea. It wants your actions to feel meaningful. It wants them to look significant. It wants proof that what you are doing is enough. And when it does not get that proof, it tells you to wait, to delay, to come back when you can do it better. But discipline does not wait for ideal conditions. It operates inside imperfect ones. It understands that doing something small is not a compromise. It is a strategy. Because every time you move, even in a minimal way, you maintain momentum. And momentum is what prevents stagnation. The moment you stop completely, restarting becomes harder. Not physically, but mentally. You have to overcome resistance again. You have to rebuild the habit again. You have to convince yourself again. But when you allow imperfect movement, you never fully stop. You stay connected to the process, even if it is just a small action, even if it feels insignificant. And that consistency compounds. It builds rhythm. It reinforces identity. It reduces the gap between intention and action. This is the shift. You stop asking, "Is this enough?" And you start asking, "Is this moving me forward?" Because forward does not require perfection. It requires direction. And direction can be maintained through the smallest possible action. This is what most people fail to accept. They think progress must look a certain way, that it must be visible, measurable, undeniable. But real progress is often quiet. It happens in the days where you show up without intensity, in the moments where you do the minimum instead of nothing, in the decision to continue, even when it does not feel impressive. That is where discipline stabilizes, not in peak performance, but in sustained movement. And once you understand that, something changes. You stop fearing imperfection. You stop waiting for the ideal version of yourself. You start working with the version that exists right now. And that is enough to keep you moving. But that leads to a deeper realization. If small actions are enough to create movement, then maybe your definition of progress has been wrong all along. The reprogramming of what progress means. At some point, without noticing, you adopted a definition of progress that works against you. You started believing that progress has to be visible, that it has to be measurable in obvious ways, that it needs to look like growth, feel like advancement, show clear results that confirm you are moving forward. And when that does not happen, you assume something is wrong. You assume you are stuck. You assume your effort is not working. So you slow down. You question your actions. You consider stopping, not because you are incapable, but because you are not seeing the kind of results you expected. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Because real progress rarely looks the way you think it should. It is not always dramatic. It is not always noticeable. And most of the time, it is not immediately rewarding. In fact, real progress often feels like repetition. It feels like doing the same thing again and again without visible change. It feels like effort without confirmation. It feels like movement without evidence. And that is exactly why most people stop. Because they are waiting for proof. Proof that what they are doing matters. Proof that they are getting somewhere. Proof that their effort is worth continuing. But that proof comes later. Much later than most people are willing to wait. So instead of continuing, they interrupt the process. They change direction. They abandon consistency. They search for something that feels more effective, more efficient, more immediately rewarding. And in doing so, they reset their progress, over and over again. This is the cycle, not because they lack discipline, but because their definition of progress is flawed. They are measuring the wrong things. They are focusing on outcomes instead of continuity. They are looking for visible change instead of internal alignment. But progress is not always something you can see. Sometimes it is something you are building beneath the surface. It is the strengthening of habits, the reduction of resistance, the increase in consistency, the quiet stabilization of your behavior. These are forms of progress that do not create immediate results, but they create the conditions for results to happen. And without them, nothing sustainable is built. This is the shift. You stop asking, "What did I achieve today?" And you start asking, "Did I stay consistent with what matters?" Because achievement fluctuates. Consistency accumulates. One depends on variables you cannot fully control. The other depends on your ability to show up. And when you prioritize consistency, something changes. You remove the pressure to constantly prove progress. You stop depending on immediate results to validate your effort. You begin to trust the process, not because you see the outcome, but because you understand how outcomes are formed. Through repetition, through continuity, through actions that compound over time. This changes your relationship with discipline. It no longer feels like something you do for results. It becomes something you do regardless of them. Because you understand that results are delayed but never denied when the process is maintained. And that understanding gives you stability. It allows you to continue even when nothing seems to be happening, even when there is no visible sign of improvement, even when doubt starts to appear. Because now you are not relying on evidence. You are relying on structure. And that is what keeps you moving. But that leads to one of the hardest challenges you will face. What happens when you continue and still see nothing? No validation, no recognition, no confirmation that you are on the right path. Can you keep going without any evidence at all? The courage to continue without evidence. There comes a point where effort feels invisible. You are doing what you said you would do. You are showing up. You are maintaining consistency. You are following the structure you built, and yet nothing seems to change. No clear results, no external validation, no signs that what you are doing is leading somewhere meaningful. This is where most people stop, not because they are tired of the work, but because they are tired of not seeing the outcome. They begin to question everything. Is this even working? Am I wasting my time? Should I be doing something else? And those questions are powerful. Because without evidence, your mind starts searching for certainty. It wants reassurance. It wants confirmation that your effort is not being wasted. It wants something tangible to justify continuing. But in many cases, that confirmation does not come when you expect it. Not because your effort is ineffective, but because results operate on a delay. There is a gap between what you do and what you see. And that gap is where discipline is tested at its highest level. Because continuing without evidence requires a different kind of strength. It is not physical. It is not emotional. It is structural. It is the ability to rely on your system instead of your feelings, to trust your actions instead of your immediate results, to keep moving, not because you are certain, but because you decided to move regardless of certainty. This is what separates temporary effort from long-term consistency. Anyone can act when results are visible. Anyone can stay committed when progress is obvious. But very few can continue when everything feels static, when nothing confirms that they are on the right path, when the only thing they have is their own decision to keep going. This is where most people turn back. They change direction too early. They abandon what was working simply because it was not showing results fast enough. They confuse lack of evidence with lack of progress. And in doing so, they interrupt the very process that would have led them forward. Because what they do not see is what is happening underneath. The accumulation of effort, the strengthening of discipline, the reduction of resistance, the alignment between intention and action, all of this is building, quietly, without visibility, without recognition, without immediate reward. And that is exactly why it is so difficult to maintain. Because you are being asked to invest energy into something that has not yet proven itself. You are being asked to continue without guarantees, to trust a process that has not given you feedback. This is where courage becomes necessary. Not the kind of courage that faces external challenges, but the kind that faces internal doubt. The kind that says, I will continue, even if I cannot see where this is going yet. That is a rare decision, because it goes against your instinct for certainty. It requires you to detach from immediate validation, to stop depending on results as proof, and to start depending on consistency as your foundation. This is the shift. You no longer ask, "Is this working?" You ask, "Am I staying aligned with what I decided matters?" Because alignment is within your control. Results are not. And when you anchor yourself in what you can control, something changes. You become less reactive, less dependent on external signals, more stable in your behavior. And that stability allows you to continue long enough for results to finally appear, because they do. But only for those who stay. Only for those who do not interrupt the process. Only for those who are willing to move forward without needing immediate proof. And once you reach that point, once you build that level of trust in your own actions, another shift becomes necessary. Because continuing is one thing, but how you relate to the outcome of your actions is what determines whether you can sustain that consistency. Detachment from outcomes as a mental strategy. At some point, effort alone is not enough to sustain you. You can be consistent. You can show up. You can do everything you said you would do. But if your emotional state is still tied to the outcome, your stability will always be fragile. Because outcomes are unpredictable. They do not always reflect your effort in the short term. They do not always arrive when you expect. And sometimes they do not come in the form you imagined. When your discipline is attached to results, your consistency becomes conditional. You feel motivated when things go well. You feel discouraged when they do not. You push harder when you see progress. You slow down when you do not. And without realizing it, your behavior starts to fluctuate based on something you cannot fully control. This is the hidden instability. It is not about whether you are disciplined. It is about whether your discipline depends on feedback. Because if it does, you will always be vulnerable. Every delay will feel like failure. Every setback will feel like proof that something is wrong. Every lack of recognition will feel like a reason to question your path. And that emotional reaction slowly erodes your consistency, not all at once, but enough to break your rhythm. This is why detachment becomes necessary, not as a way to stop caring, but as a way to protect your ability to continue. Detachment means you stop linking your effort to immediate results. You stop expecting a return for every action. You stop measuring your worth by what happens externally. Instead, you shift your focus from outcome to execution, from result to process, from validation to alignment. This is what the Stoics emphasized. As expressed in the teachings of Epictetus, your control lies in your actions, not in what those actions produce. And as reflected in the writings of Marcus Aurelius in Meditations, Book 6, Paragraph 2, the value of your work is defined by your commitment to it, not by the external recognition it receives. This perspective changes how you experience effort. You no longer feel like you are investing into something uncertain. You feel like you are reinforcing something within your control. Your focus becomes narrower, clearer, more stable. You are no longer asking, "What will I get from this?" You are asking, "Did I execute what I said I would do?" And that question grounds you, because it removes dependency. It removes expectation. It removes the emotional volatility that comes from waiting for results. And in that space, discipline becomes sustainable. Not because it is easier, but because it is no longer tied to something unstable. You begin to operate with a different mindset. You act because it is aligned, not because it is rewarded. You continue because it is your standard, not because it is working fast enough. And that shift gives you resilience, because now setbacks do not break you. Delays do not discourage you. Lack of recognition does not affect your consistency. You remain stable. You remain focused. You remain in motion. And ironically, this is when results start to appear more consistently, not because you chase them harder, but because you stop depending on them to continue. This is the paradox. The less attached you are to outcomes, the more consistent your actions become. And the more consistent your actions become, the more likely results are to follow. But even with this mental stability, there is still one phase that tests your discipline in a different way. Because not all progress is visible, not all growth is recognized, and sometimes The most important changes happen in complete silence. The silent reconstruction. There is a phase where nothing about your life looks different from the outside. No visible transformation, no obvious milestones, no external confirmation that something is changing. If someone looked at you from a distance, they would assume everything is the same. But internally, something is being rebuilt, quietly, without announcement, without recognition. This is the stage most people underestimate, because it does not feel like progress, it feels like repetition. You wake up, you follow through, you do what needs to be done, again, and again, and again, without excitement, without novelty, without any clear signal that things are improving. And because of that, it becomes easy to question. Is this even making a difference? Why does everything feel the same? When will this actually change? These questions start to surface because your environment has not yet caught up with your effort. There is a delay, a gap between internal change and external reflection. And inside that gap, everything feels invisible. But that invisibility is not a sign that nothing is happening. It is a sign that something deeper is taking place. You are not producing outcomes yet. You are restructuring patterns. You are not changing your results yet. You are changing your behavior. You are not transforming your life in a visible way. You are transforming how you operate within it. And that kind of change does not create immediate evidence. It builds quietly. It stabilizes slowly. It strengthens without needing attention. This is what makes it so difficult to sustain, because your mind is still wired to look for signs, for confirmation, for something that proves your effort is leading somewhere. But in this phase, there is none. There is only repetition, only consistency, only the decision to continue without feedback. And that is where most people stop. Not because they failed, but because they could not see what was forming. They assumed that because nothing looked different, nothing was different. So they abandoned the process right before it had the chance to reveal itself. This is the critical point, because silent reconstruction is where discipline becomes permanent. It is where your actions stop feeling forced, where your structure becomes natural, where your identity stabilizes without needing constant reinforcement. But none of that is visible at first. It happens beneath the surface, like a foundation being rebuilt before anything new can be placed on top of it. And if you interrupt it too early, you lose that foundation. You go back to instability, back to inconsistency, back to relying on motivation instead of structure. This is why patience is not optional here, not passive patience, active patience, the kind that continues to act even when nothing seems to change, the kind that understands that visibility is delayed, that results are forming even if they are not yet showing. This is where trust becomes essential, not trust in outcomes, but trust in the process you are following, trust in the structure you are maintaining, trust in the fact that repetition is not wasted, even when it feels unnoticed. Because eventually, something shifts, not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. The changes you have been building internally begin to reflect externally. Your actions become sharper. Your decisions become clearer. Your direction becomes more stable. And what once felt invisible starts to become real. But that moment only comes if you stay long enough, if you resist the urge to stop just because nothing is showing yet, if you allow the reconstruction to complete itself. Because once it does, you reach a realization that changes how you see everything that came before. You begin to understand that you were never as lost as you thought you were. The day you realize you were never lost, there comes a moment where everything clicks, but not in the way you expected. It is not a sudden breakthrough. It is not a dramatic realization that changes everything overnight. It is quieter than that, more grounded, more real. You look at your life and, for the first time in a long time, things make sense again. Not because everything is perfect, but because you can see the path you have been walking. You begin to notice something you could not see before. Every moment of confusion, every period of doubt, every phase where you felt lost was not random. It was part of the process. At the time, it felt like you were drifting, like you were stuck, like you were moving without direction. But now, with distance, you can see it differently. You were not lost. You were in transition. You were in a phase where clarity had not yet formed, but movement was still necessary. And the only thing that kept you from completely falling apart was the fact that you did not stop, even when it felt pointless, even when it felt unclear, even when nothing seemed to be working. You kept moving. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not consistently at first, but enough to stay connected, enough to avoid complete stagnation. And that made all the difference, because now you understand something most people never realize. Clarity was never meant to come before action. It was meant to emerge from it. You were not supposed to have all the answers. You were supposed to keep going without them. And discipline was the bridge, the thing that carried you through the uncertainty, the thing that allowed you to act when your thoughts were unclear, the thing that kept your life moving when your emotions were unstable. You start to see your past differently, not as a series of mistakes or delays, but as a sequence of necessary phases that shaped how you think, how you act, how you respond. You realize that every time you chose to continue, even in a minimal way, you were building something, not just progress, but resilience, not just results, but identity. And that identity is what you stand on now. You are no longer waiting to feel ready. You are no longer depending on clarity to act. You are no longer negotiating with yourself every time something requires effort. You move because that is who you are now. And that is the shift. You stop asking, what if I get lost again? Because now you know. Getting lost was never the problem. Stopping was. And as long as you keep moving, even without certainty, even without perfect direction, you are never truly off track. You are simply in motion. And motion, when sustained, always leads somewhere. That is the part most people never reach. Not because they are incapable, but because they stopped before they could see it. You did not. And that is why everything feels different now. Not because the path became easier, but because you became the kind of person who no longer needs to see the path to walk it.